just to say that Bright Blue is running a year-long project on developing a balanced centre-right approach on immigration. It has various different components, one of which is this commission. We've already received various bits of written evidence from expert organisations and individuals. We got that in August, and the second part of the commission is this oral evidence session. It's being filmed, so it will be live on our website in a couple of weeks' time. The transcripts from this and the written evidence will be part of an appendix of our final report, which is coming out towards the end of the year. And on top of that, we'll have some policy recommendations from Bright Blue. The commissioners here, all from different backgrounds, different perspectives, won't necessarily endorse all of the policies that we come out with, but they're going to have some searching questions for you today. So how we'll work it is that I'll ask you to introduce yourself and then say a few introductory remarks about integration in the UK at the moment, how you think that's faring, and how you think government could go further in developing a more integrated society. So perhaps we'll start with Dr. Sigona.
Okay, Nando Sigona from the Institute for Research into Super Diversity at the University of Birmingham and Research Associate at the University of Oxford, Compass and the Refugee Studies Centre. So in relation to integration, I think that, well, there is plenty of work to do. And the way that I will sort of approach the issue is by look at different groups in particular, because there seems to be a different range of issues that should be addressed. First of all, my impression is that the emphasis on security and securitization and the emphasis on migration and arrivals is actually having a serious detrimental impact on integration. Obviously, the term integration is complicated and need to be defined in details. But in a sense, if we look from the perspective of developing a sense of belonging to a broader community, a shared value, you could say that the continuous targeting of foreign-born people, even if actually they may target the one that may have a different skin colors or the specific skin color, specific religious group, is actually antagonizing a broader range of people within society. And in that sense, the obsession, for example, with the net migration targets, I think, is actually produced a lot of drawbacks on broader set of issues which involved community relations. So that would be one dimension of it. This is also affecting EU migrants, and gradually you could see how the EU migrants have become target more and more of discussion about, attaching a price tag to individuals, how much do you value to society, and this sort of discussion is actually relatively new. Well, at the moment it seems like everyone talks in those terms. Till very recently, very few people would have dared to incorporate in discussion on migration, for example, German migrants, a German citizen that lives in UK. So that's what you can see is actually a shift going on at the moment, with this focus on migration, which is creating a lot of antagonism in various constituencies. On a different level, I think that the issue of integration needs a serious rethinking also in terms of taking stock of the significant transformation of society in the last 10 to 20 years. In particular, I think that the introduction of dispersal policies and all the new arrival that started from the early 90s have produced a change in the population of Britain, which is, people like Stephen Bertovic talk in terms of super diversity. Now, while the terms has got still need to be much clearly defined, has got, I think, one important element there is the fact that it's much more difficult to define the term integration in terms of what are you integrating into, when actually what was considered the core set of society, value of societies, is actually become much more fragmented, much more multiple and diverse than when you're talking about integration, what are we talking about? And this is a question which has got several ramifications. One of the latest one is actually all the debate about the ISIS fighters, isn't it? In a sense that you could see very clearly how an issue of foreign policy is becoming an issue of home affair and internal policy. This was not the case until not long ago, but in a sense, this is also a very important electoral constituencies that hasn't got an impact in society. The way that the government responds, not specifically to the terrorist threat, but the fact that when you attach a terrorist threat, a lot of people see that the government is victimizing a very large part of the population, which is the Muslim population, is actually an issue that has a repercussion on integration broadly defined. So I think there is a very large set of issues, I think, that when we talk about integration should be actually addressed.
Can I just say, you mentioned that the immigration debate is related to more antagonistic attitudes towards certain migrant communities. Where's the evidence for that? Is there any evidence?
Well, you could see actually, there has been, in terms of media study on the media and the representation of migration issues in the media, you can find evidence in terms that the public discourse around these issues and the way that it's portrayed in the media is tend to be negative, and the prevalence of specific terms. I think, the work that even the Migration Observatory has been doing about the study of the corpus is identify some sort of prevalence of some terms in the way that migration has been discussed. And
so media rather than public attitudes. You haven't told us anything about hardening public attitudes on minorities or race through knowing that that's in the media.
Well, actually, there is some evidence about the fact that the public attitude for specific group of people tend to be more.
Which groups?
The Muslim, you would say.
Yeah.
Well, for example, earlier today we heard supporters of refugee rights claiming that the public is much more supportive of granting Syrian refugees asylum than politicians fear because they're reading the Daily Mail. Do you not think that's true?
I think it's true. It would probably be true. I mean, that's true. I mean, I won't know. I mean, probably if they were saying that, probably based on some sort of survey evidence, I would think the main understanding is obviously the attention that has been paid on Syria at the moment, especially in the fact of creating a support for the potentially humanitarian intervention in the area, as I got as a back somehow, almost as a draw, as side effect, the fact that in a way you have to justify your humanitarian intervention there as a way of being humanitarian here. However, another dynamic you can observe very clearly is that the sympathetic attitude with the Syrians seems to stop as soon as they cross the Mediterranean. So while we seems to be so very supportive of them as long as they stay in Jordan, Turkey, and in the neighboring countries, it looks like that once they cross the Mediterranean, they become illegals. They get met from Frontex and all the other infrastructure of the European Union. And while there may be a lot of talk about, let's be welcoming them, what you see in terms of evidence is that the numbers are very tiny compared to the kind of humanitarian efforts that other countries are putting in terms of support.
Well, yes, those are the numbers that are actually, those are the numbers that politicians are agreeing to, but we're talking about public opinion.
I think I would agree.
I would take a slightly warmer, slightly more optimistic view, which I think would be good news if my view is true for Bright Blue. I think, firstly, it feels to me immigration is less racialised, not more racialised. Long-term intergenerational shift against racism in British society as it's got more diverse, and the post-2004 arrival of a very, very large group of white Christian East Europeans has done that, and therefore integration is also less about immigration these days because the Windrush was a long time ago. So, but where I think you're right, and I'd agree, is therefore there are very big challenges about specific groups. People, for example, have rather warm views about Polish migrants, even though they think the whole thing has been entirely messed up by the government. British Muslims, it feels to me the questions of integration, the self-perceptions of the group and the reputation of that group in society, feels to me we've got the race politics of the 1980s in 2014 with that group, and that has a polarisation. And Roma and Romanians are treated very differently to Bulgarians and Poles for all sorts of reasons, I think, when you do groups on them. So I don't know what we do about that, but it might be helpful for us to separate integration from immigration more. In fact, I mean, we should be clear about what we want new migrants to do, but the challenges of a city like Birmingham and its education system say it's not an immigration question now so much.
Yeah, I mean, and following that, just the sort of separation of integration and immigration. It's interesting what you're saying about antagonism towards Muslims, because I don't think there is any evidence to suggest that current government immigration policy is causing that anxiety, but there are other issues at play, including foreign policy, as you mentioned, unless I am not aware of some evidence on that. I don't think it's a current government policy approach on immigration specifically which is driving that, is it? Unless there's any other-
I think when I was talking about the emphasis on secularization, I was not talking of specific policy being introduced, but in a way that we talk about, not we, but actually is talked within the public discourse. So not the public attitude, but the way that it has been discussed, the way that people feel like you're being targeted. So not necessarily a change of policy determine a change in the way that the public discourse that represent. The point about separating, I will actually certainly agree that we should be able to separating issues related to migration or immigration in terms of the governing the arrival and settlement with issues of long-term integration. What I seem to see now is one that while you may want to separate them in terms of the social networks that of the individuals within some of these communities, the fact that you treat very badly someone who's just arrived, who is from the same community, maybe a cousin, I think has an effect on the way that I feel about being here. So, for example, just to take it on a different level, as a EU migrant myself, as an Italian, I feel much more uncomfortable towards being a resident in UK in the last year and a half, since basically gradually the US has been portrayed in a certain way, since the Romanian migrants have been targeted so strongly by somehow in the political debate. So in a sense, no one has said particularly something about Italian, although there has been a protest in the past about the Italian workers have been stealing the British job with Gordon Brown and things like that. But that was a one-off event as a target as a group. But you have to think about that even if you want to separate, the things are not in very separate. And the link between foreign and in home affair, home internal policies was actually, to give you an example of that. I mean, you have to explore much more the ramification. All the debate around diaspora politics is partly linked to this in a way.
Okay, so can I bring Sam in first and then we'll take questions?
I'm Sam Freeman. I am currently the Director of Research Evaluation and Impact at Teach First. I'm not here today representing Teach First, just to be clear. I'm here in a personal capacity. And I was formerly an advisor to Michael Gove on schools. My interest in this area is very much through the education and schools lens. It's not something I've worked on in any other capacity. So I'm particularly interested in integration in schools, and it's been obviously a salient issue this year because of what has happened in Birmingham in particular. But that's not an entirely isolated case. I'm also quite interested in the impacts of changes in ethnicity on academic attainment, particularly in the context of London, where London has massively improved in terms of academic attainment over the past 10 to 15 years, and I think there's good evidence that is partly due down to changes in ethnic mix and migration. So they're two very different things, but that they'd be the sort of areas of interest I'd have in this space.
Okay, thank you. David?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure you know, Sam, schools tend to be more segregated than the areas that they serve. I mean, Simon Burgess has done a lot of work on this. Just to throw a couple of figures at you, I think come from Burgess. 75% of London's black population live in majority white areas, but less than half of black kids of primary school age attend majority white schools. 60% of South Asians live in majority white areas, but only about a third of South Asian primary kids are in white majority schools. So we are seeing, and of course we've had issues outside London, in the north of England, obviously in Birmingham. Is there anything in a pretty liberal society where people are broadly speaking free to choose where they send their kids to school within limits, obviously? What can we do to kind of nudge people's choices and help them choose to send their kids to more mixed schools, including white parents, obviously? How optimistic are you about the future on this? I mean, there are one or two experiments. There's the Waterhead Academy up in Oldham, where they've merged an almost wholly Pakistani school and a wholly white school, which seems to have got off to a reasonable start, and we keep an eye on that. How do you see it going, and what might we do to push it?
It's a very complicated question. I think in London, there's all sorts of very odd effects that happen. So primary there's less segregation than there is at secondary in terms of the numbers of white British children in schools. What you have in inner London especially is when people have kids that reach secondary age, they tend to leave inner London if they can afford to do so, which creates more segregation. So the figures on sort of white British children in inner London in secondary, they're now in a small minority actually. So it's almost less a question of integration than how do you support a population that's almost entirely non-white British in certain boroughs. I think that's quite a different question to what happened in Birmingham, where you had essentially, as far as we can tell, a takeover of a particular academy trust by a certain group. I'm not aware of another incident like that anywhere else in the country as yet. So I think we'd have to look at that separately. But I think sort of the general, London particularly, but also some other urban areas, Leicester, Birmingham to some extent, Manchester to some extent, you have now, certainly at secondary stage, very a heavy majority non-white British population. So it's more about how do you...
Okay, in areas where it's, I mean, you might say it's too late in some ways in London in terms of integration between ethnic minority Brits and majority ethnicity Brits, but that isn't true in many other, are there lessons we can learn in a way in terms of preventing white exit, making people on both sides of the ethnic divide more comfortable with mixing, or is it just inevitable?
I actually think, I think parents tend to choose schools on the basis of school quality on the whole, or their assessment of school quality. There is evidence of segregation, but it's as much around school quality as it is around ethnicity, and the two things are sort of linked because obviously ethnic groups tend to be poorer, but some ethnic groups tend to be poorer than other ethnic groups.
I thought there was some evidence on. I thought there was some evidence on school quality. When parents are choosing schools, that they do go for the type of other students there. Is that linked to ethnicity, or is that just more of a?
I haven't seen evidence of that being that it is particularly linked to ethnicity. I think there is evidence that people choose on socioeconomic class as a proxy for attainment. But it may be true, but I haven't seen any evidence.
It'd be really good to try and tease this out. I think because I'm with David on this. That I think it'd be good to have a preference, and then if you have the preference, the question of whether you had any ability to bring it about would be important. I mean, the attitudes data says that minority parents want to choose mixed schools. A bit more than they get them. Obviously, there'll be a group that don't want to choose mixed schools, and that's a different issue. But there seems to be a sort of tipping point effect, where if something goes, beyond 60, 2/3 one thing, it will go monoethnic, both white and non-white. So the question of, and then it's very, very.
I mean, I can think of anecdotal situations where I think I've seen that happen. I'm just not sure it's been written.
And then the question of whether or not. So there may be a collective action problem here, where actually most people would choose the schools that look like the town, but once they are 70% one thing and 70% the other.
I mean, there's been a bit of that certainly has happened in East London, where you have seen real segregation.
But that raises the issue of should local authorities or or the Department of Education or whoever is managing schools, should they have a presumption that a school, wherever possible, should have a mix that reflects, as you say, not the particular neighbourhood, but the whole town, or the whole local authority area. So in Bradford, it might be 60-40, whatever. That should be a sort of specific target for schools in an area to reflect, as far as possible, the overall ethnic balance of the kind of region.
I'm not sure how logistically you do that, though. I mean, because the parental choice at the moment overrides everything else in the system.
Can I say something different?
But there is banding, isn't there? I mean,
you can band by results. So you can do fair banding so that you have a quarter of your intake.
Can we say
I
clever with
also
school
learned,
catchment
I noticed
areas
the
here?
ones to
I mean,
come in.
outside of London, I mean, people in London have much more choice, which is another reason for why results have been good, not just aspirational minorities, although that's probably true as well. But outside London, I mean, most people go to their local school, don't they? I mean, in which case it is possible that you could, where local authorities still operate, you could sort of you play clever with the catchment area, so you make sure that your catchment area includes mixed areas.
I think it'd be really good to try and dig more into this, just because I mean, in the end,
Take
if contact really matters, and there are lots of good things to say it does, it's a bit second best if you're teaching kids in two mono-ethnic schools at other ends of the town about a multi-faith society and doing the odd trip to play football when you could be, doing it all year round. So I've been favourite. But I want to ask Sam something a bit different, which is about more diversity. I think you're saying to us, one of the big educational impacts is better results, including for the white British kids as well, which seems like a happy thing to happen if it happens to everyone. How strongly could we say, and we were hearing a bit maybe that it does, how strongly can we say we expect to see that? We've seen it in London, but we probably expect to see it in Lincolnshire as well, or don't we know? And then secondly, what does that mean if you're interested in the left behind groups? And now it's the case that the ethnic minorities are more likely to be the undergraduates, but Afro-Caribbean boys might be doing badly, and white working class boys might be doing badly. How do people who are worried about educational inequalities think about something that probably isn't the paradigm they started with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the IFS came up with the IFS report recently on London success indicated that about half of the improvement in results in London had been due to immigration as a sort of guide figure. Whether the kind of immigration you get into other parts of the country would have the same effects, I don't think we know that. It's noticeable that if you like, the sort of second and third place cities in terms of improvement have been Birmingham and Manchester. So it is urban areas that have seen migration that are improving, but then you still have quite poor systems in Bradford, Leicester, which have also seen migration. So.
I think there are two things important here. One is, and I go back to the super diversity elements, that you cannot use the ethnic belonging as the only criteria there. I mean, in a sense, because probably one of the things you'll find out that in London you have the profile of within a specific nationality in terms of social class education is significantly different than one in Coventry or wherever you want to look. I mean, so in a sense, you have to be able to look at these things in sort of the intersection, because otherwise you get a kind of a biased.
But you're looking at very fast catch-up of the groups that were poor and disadvantaged still down at the bottom in London, and it's gone up. So
but London has got to also a much more varied, in terms of, a lot of the migrants who come to London are sort of very much oriented to with ambitions, oriented to success, affirmation. If you look at probably a lot of the groups that came recently may have some different figure. In some cases, it's an hypothesis to test. The other thing about the challenges of the ethnic quota system in terms of representation is that you have to consider that among the various ethnic groups or nationalities, they have very different demographic profile. So in a sense, you may not find the same number of kids from one group than another. So in a sense, that's something that would be a challenge in terms of.
No one's looking for perfect, mapping onto.
I'm telling responding. If you come up to me with this message, let's create a representation of that. I'll tell you, well, it's probably a bit more difficult than it looks like, because not every group has
Just
that.
add that it has to be done with sort of maximum empathy, because just from a completely different end of the societal spectrum, but the private schools were doing ethnic quotas illegally for years, but it was very well known. It caused massive amounts of ethnic tension. It became another thing that it became another thing for parents to resent each other over, and that's always what we're going to have to deal with when parental choice is under pressure.
And it's worth saying forced integration in America destroyed the function of the American school system. I mean, it just blew that apart.
Well, that's the way they did it. I mean, you don't want to be busting.
Obviously don't do it like that, but yeah.
That's why the nudging.
So it's about empathy. Well.
I think in fact the point about diversity is actually crucial. I mean, in a sense, it's almost an ethic of diversity, and there has been research done, for example, around acne. Tower Hamlets shows how the different local discourse around diversity, valuing diversity, how it's become embedded in the way the school operate and related within the other community in place, has an impact on the environment in which the pedagogical project happened. I mean, it's quite important. So not necessarily which groups are represented, by the idea that becomes somehow the way that you approach the pedagogy.
Would you agree then that you know, to the extent where there was some very worrying stuff in, you know, a minority of the schools that were investigated in Birmingham, that was the opposite of an ethic of diversity. That was an ethic of not diversity, you know, with a minority population, was it? I mean, that presumably would not be a Nando. That would not be a sort of pro-diversity approach.
Well, I mean, I would guess that. But this go back in terms of. I think you cannot compare the system of the private public school with the state school. What I'm sort of thinking, the way I was thinking at the idea is, if you are in a state school and you got more or less a similar profile of population, I would suspect, and it would be good to test it, is that the place that you're going to get better success is the place with endorsed diversity model. The other thing is in a school system which is mainly based on you know, kind of we are all the same, we all belong to the same social class, where the colors or the ethnic belonging is an issue, but up to a point, because obviously you have the cosmopolitan students that go there. It's a kind of completely different set of issues that you are. I'm not sure you can compare necessarily the attainments between these two sets.
Can I just come back slightly more to the sort of wider point about integration and how we measure it in terms of how successful immigrants are? So Anthony Heath's work at Oxford is, well, actually immigrants are quite well integrated. They assimilate well, they're very favourable towards British institutions, their adoption of English language is very high, so he's very positive about it. But then there's been a recent report from the Social Integration Commission which suggests that actually even in London there isn't as high interactions, friendships, daily kind of talking between different ethnicities as you would first assume. So in London, for example, in absolute terms, yes, people from different ethnic backgrounds are good friends, meeting each other regularly, talking to each other regularly, but in proportional terms, London is lower, which is quite interesting. Of the population around you, how many engagements are you expected to have with people with different ethnicities is lower in London than elsewhere, so there's still a problem there. So really the heart of all of this is what are the measures of success for integration? What should we be using?
It's a huge debate into migration studies. One way of looking at it is actually what is your expectation? What are we talking about in terms of what you want to measure, essentially? I mean, in a sense, and this is in US actually. The debate in US would be very interesting around this, because there has been a lot of there is a very good access to data and measuring. So it's possible to, for example, see how across generation, first, second generation, one generation, have different attainment, how the some groups are better they are in terms of achievement, and how they can access the middle class better. They can move into change their consumer behaviors. So if you are interested in that, there are methodologies that you could apply, but I think the fact that people may have not many friends from another groups, in a sense, the fact that people from very different backgrounds living together didn't kill each other, to me, is actually a sign that people are peacefully sharing a space. So you could also turn it the other way around. That was, and the idea is, if you look in terms of integration functionally and you want to measure access to job market, is one element. One element that I think is really interesting, we should be more focused on, is the generational dimension to this. I think there should be much more work done in terms of showing to the extent to which someone just arrived after many years, which generation you can get then. And there's been work in the past in UK a lot around this, but much less recently with the new communities. It would be interesting to push a better understanding of these processes.
The thing I'm least aware of finding, it might just be that it doesn't exist, is we know that in British society generally there have been enormous shifts in attitudes by generation and age, because people have grown up in a very situation. I've seen no good hard evidence about the shifts within the minority communities by generation and by age, and yet there'd be a good reason to guess that you know, if the grandparents and parents were mostly migrants, often from very different situations, and the younger generation are mostly British born, but it can play both ways across 2 and 3 generations. There are lots of dynamics. Dandy, do we know anything about you know, what difference that has made? You know, is that a very rapid change, or is it a slower change?
Can I just chip in, because I've got to go in a sec? I mean, there is also the the countervailing factor of the larger critical mass you have for a minority, the less you have to
mix with
There are lots of drivers,
with
and
the
you always
ethnic
rebel
majorities.
against your
Yeah.
parents as well, or your grandparents. So, but it
And
would
we're
be lovely to
certainly-
know what.
I mean, the work that
what
Eric
your
Kaufman has done. I mean, you know, we're doing a lot of work on this at Demos on our mapping integration project, and I mean, Eric Kaufman has these rather depressing figures from the 2011 census. He's done a ward analysis of the 2011 census, and almost half, so 45%, I think, of ethnic minority Britons, I'm not sure if that's visible minority or just ethnic minority in general, including white ethnic minorities, live in wards where less than half the population is white British. And as recently as 2001, that figure was only 25%.
Yeah, but that's because the London median shifted, so it's a sort of. Because the London
But I mean, this is a
median
massive
45%.
shift in 10 years of concentration of minorities away from living in, you know, in the same vicinity
Yeah, but
as
the average-
members of the ethnic
The average
majority.
went to 45%, then a lot of people.
This is
end
not just
up-
London.
Well,
This is the entire country.
Precisely.
This is the whole country. I mean, that is a big shift in the wrong direction, I thought. While at the same time, of course, attitudes have changed, you'd have thought, in a more positive direction. You know, again, it's a sort of collective action
Yeah.
issue. People want to be more mixed than they are actually turning out to be, either in residence or in schooling.
It's actually, it's sort of only slightly tangentially, but it's very interesting because I'm sort of, I guess, a fifth generation immigrant in a way, because my great grandparents migrated over here. But the Jewish community has become started to use Jewish schools a lot more in the past few years than it had been doing previously. So actually now over half of Jewish kids are in Jewish schools, which is a complete change from where it was 10 years ago. So it's even very, very sort of integrated groups you'd think would be very integrated groups.
Yeah, there's an element
There's
of
the-
hunkering down.
yeah,
You're seeing that in London.
which is quite
And
interesting.
you can also see that in the number of cases where fights are going on about the extent to which parents have to be practicing Jewish, and similarly in other faith schools, that has become such an issue.
Mm.
The Cardinal Vaughan has had a major issue over it again, because people are hunkering down and trying to reassert a faith identity even on schools that had children of mixed heritage.
We're going to be chucked out soon. So my final question, unless anyone has another question, is on this. Are there sort of things, policies that we should be advocating to improve integration, particularly in the education space, Sam? So we've talked about there's still a lot of ethnic segregation. What sort of policy levers can we pull to try and encourage more mixing? And then more generally, I suppose, you know, across different institutions, public services, the economy, are there any ways that you could see that we can become more integrated? So perhaps let's start with Sam.
I'm very sceptical about trying to use the admission system to drive changes in behaviour. It's a very blunt tool and usually goes wrong when people try and use the admission system to change people's behaviour. It's a bit of a cop-out, but in a way the best driver of integration will be having better schools, because the better a school is, the more it appeals to everybody. And you know, you see it through socioeconomic lens, that when a school that is struggling, if it suddenly improves, its socioeconomic mix will change over the next 5 years on a bit of a lag. And I suspect that's also true around integration to some extent. There are, however, communities that where, and I say that there's still a fairly small number of communities where things have moved further than that now, and you do have real separation. And I don't know how you deal with those areas. I'm thinking mainly East London, bits of Birmingham, and then bits of Midlands towns as well. Where
Do you have a view about the Oldham example that David mentioned, where you decide to press the reset button? I mean, in extremis, is that very risky or something you do?
Yeah, I'm not sure we know if that's worked yet. I think and it was incredibly expensive. I mean, they literally rebuilt every school in Oldham. So I mean, it's not something that you can use everywhere as a policy lever. But it may be that in those small small number of communities where you have now got complete separation, you may need to do something more radical. Whereas in areas where there might be just a bit of drift in the wrong direction as well. And then of course, separately from that, you've got the issue of faith schools, which is a massive issue, which we could happily spend several hours talking about. But there is an increase in the number of state faith schools, and and that does drive segregation, and it's a separate debate in a way, but it's an important one, whether we want to keep pushing that. And I've always been obviously I'm a supporter of the free schools policy. I was very involved in setting it up, but I am nervous about how at the edges it's being used to set up more faith schools. So I think about that as well.
Actually, I would very second that approach. I mean, when I look at the Trojan horse thing in Birmingham, one way of looking at it is the idea that once you give up the role of the state in terms of providing, a pedagogic project, and the idea that was behind the state education as to basically creating a shared common ground, then that is actually maybe the extreme, but basically you are drifting in that direction. So the production of faith school, you are losing that sort of macro narrative that takes together the community. And one of the things that we see now is that with the death for multiculturalism as a state discourse and as a policy hasn't really found an alternative yet. As a kind of a narrative that bring people together, so I'm still part. I was giving a role, but I was still part of one shared narrative. There has been much more, and what I would say at the very beginning about the emphasis on securitization and only on arrival is part of losing that story. The story of that somehow what keep things together and working. Even if we are all diverse, people come from everywhere, we have friends or not friends, but still society works mostly. There are episodes. So try to tell that positive narrative and try to bound things together. One element more specifically in terms of creating the condition for a better integration in terms of sense of belonging, but also integration within the job market and the structure is, I think, the importance of looking into legal status and the way that the migration system operates in terms of creating insecurity. So we were talking at the very beginning about, we should keep separate integration from migration, but evidence for some show that the refugees, so people who have got recognition as a refugee, now they should fully integrate. They're really affected by the way they've been treated during the asylum process. A lot of people have been with up to 5 years in a total uncertainty. This develops a sense of, it really shapes their attitude and possibility of integration afterwards. So there is an importance to think of the way that the precarization of legal status, the fact that they have a 5 years, for example, refugee status that's renewable really doesn't create a space for thinking about the future, planning the future. It's always precarious, and we always waiting for an exam in a way. So this definitely helped to promote that sense of push to integration. So that's a more specific way of.
And just one more quite quickly, where you do have schools that are quite segregated, they can still do a great job of integration through the way that they teach and the way that they support their pupils. I'm just thinking of a school like Mulberry High School in Tower Hamlets, which is I think 97% Bangladeshi. But the head teacher there, Vanessa Ogden, has done a fantastic job of really changing the community around the school and doing a huge amount of work and getting them to support Bangladeshi girls going to university, going into employment. So you can do a lot of good work even where you've got quite segregated schools.
Might you, particularly with your issue about faith schools and schools like that, I mean, might you particularly put more expectations on schools to, it might be contact with other schools, or it might be what they're doing with the communities? I mean, should you be raising the bar to make sure that that is going on in, say for faith schools generally, their commitment to a multi-faith society, you might be asking more.
Yeah, I mean, I think we perhaps do need to rethink what our expectations of faith schools are. If we're going to keep having faith schools, which I suspect we are, because politically it would be almost impossible to not have them. It's an incredibly archaic bit of the school system, but it's still a third of primary schools and a growing number of secondary schools. And the responsibilities on those schools to, for instance, in the way they teach religion, and we could think about what they are. I mean, you obviously get massive pushback from the churches and so on, but it's an interesting debate. We don't have time for it now, but it is a really interesting area.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You are the final session of the day, so the commissioners are free to go, but thank you very much for spending some time with us.